So, my name is Amir. I run Adventures in Awareness, and we collaborate as well with the Psychedelic Society. So, a very warm welcome to Meditatio. Am I pronouncing that close to correctly? Yeah. All right. So, thanks for bearing with us as we figure out the hybrid of hello to people at home as well. We're on TV. And I just want to thank you very warmly for coming, for being interested in this topic, and also to introduce a friend and mentor, Shamil. I'm sure many of you have already read his biography, so you know that he has a PhD and he's got 38 years of meditation experience. He's linked to Imperial, to Oxford, to Cambridge. So lots of very kind of lauded accolades, which is amazing. But I'm happy to also know you personally and to know that Shamil is a very well-rounded, grounded person and has a family and does well in business. And it's really exciting for me to be mentored and learn from someone who's accomplished in academia, in science, and can really integrate this world of meditation and waking up, and things get a bit weird, but then also be very grounded and be accomplished in other areas of life. And I'm pleased to say I can bring up new ideas, and you remain open and there's conversation. So it's just exciting for me to hold a space for you to share more of what you have to offer. So thank you so much.
Great.
Warm little introduction.
Wow, this is an amazing space, and what an audience we have here, right? I can really feel that there's, from what I know of you guys, already quite a lot of meditation prowess here. Let's take a little survey, like how many people have a regular meditation practice? Okay, so that's a decent chunk. How many people are interested in the science of awakening? Okay, good. How many people have taken psychedelics, if you want to own up? All right. Okay, good. So we have, a very interesting evening this evening, because we are going to do about 50-50 science and meditation, spirituality. And really, from the audience, I can see that what we need to do is find the bridges between science and spirituality. And this is really, what I've been inspired by, because spirituality has been an amazing journey for me. But like many people in the room, we want to have some sort of, we don't like to have cognitive dissonance between our best understanding of the world, the things that make up iPhones and going to the moon, and our deepest experience and perception. Why should there be two different languages for this? And what's pretty amazing is over the last 20 years, there have actually been significant changes in our understanding of the brain, and especially what I'm going to focus on today is our understanding of the algorithms that the brain is instantiating. And this gives us a really powerful clue into the nature of our existential situation. And when you look at this philosophically, you then find that there is this deep coherence between phenomenology of meditation and finally awakening and liberation. And so that's really what we're going to go in today. And we're going to do, and it's only a short talk today, and there'll be if you're interested in the science, there'll be much more of a detailed course over the next 4 weeks after, I think there's a week gap, and then 4 weeks after that. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And it's going to be, as I said, science, but also there's going to be experiential parts. And so as I talk through the science, I'll start to do more pointing out, and then we'll do a little guided meditation, and then we'll go back and talk about some of the deeper end of spirituality, and then we'll do some Q&A. All right, good. So before we do the science, let's just settle in and relax a little bit. And just relax and just be present with whatever is going on without changing anything. And this is a good place to listen from. So let's go into the science. All right. So we're going to start with perception. The neuroscience of perception and the neuroscience of really looking at this from something called a computational neurophenomenological perspective. So that's a lot of words, but they'll be unpacked as I go through them. The phenomenology is about our experience. The neuro is that how our experience relates to what's going on in the brain. And the computational part is talking about the algorithms. What is going on from an information theoretic perspective? What is going on from processing information and how this relates to our perception and our experience. So we're in this beautiful space, and actually there are lots of lovely trees from these magnificent windows. And so let's imagine we're looking at this tree. So by the way, the reason I'm using a flip chart is I'm a scientist, so I normally have slides and high tech. And if you want some of that vibe, I'm actually going to do a lot more slides in the course that's coming. A lot of detail, but Amir actually convinced me that, hey, let's go low tech here, because we really want to connect, and I think it's a great idea. I love it, but I just want to make sure that everyone can see it. Can you see this? Okay, yeah. So we're looking at a tree, and it's a beautiful tree, autumnal colors, and somehow by looking at this tree, I've left out something here, haven't I? I've left out that we are looking at a tree. So there's kind of a subject and an object here. And it's kind of obvious, like I'm looking at this tree. Of course I'm looking at this tree. I'm seeing the tree. But how on earth does this really happen? Because what we know is that, if you look at what's going on with you get some sensory data from the scene. And this data is, in fact, really noisy and sparse. I mean, it's incredible. If you could actually see what's coming into your eyes, you really couldn't make head or tail of it. I mean, it's incredible. I've seen some simulations of this. You can try to check them out. Luckily, your brain does. And what we're going to be talking about today is how the brain does this magic trick. I do this quite often, but I think it's kind of helpful just to get an idea. We're looking at this room. If you put up your hand, arm's length distance, and look at your thumbnail, the thumbnail is about all you can see in detail and in color using the macula, the fovea, right? That's a central part of the retina. And the rest of it is kind of peripheral vision. And yet we look around and we see this perfect room in color, with straight lines and beautiful cartoonish definition. And, it's always just there. It's just like, seems to be just present. So how does that happen, given that the data is so sparse and difficult? Well, what's happening, if you asked a neuroscientist 25 years ago, they say, well, somehow the brain is reproducing what we're seeing through the sensory surfaces of the body, the retina and the sensory cortices. But and so in some magical way, we have some sort of representation of a tree. But how could that representation be there? And of course, I'm going to come back to this, but there's a representation of us looking at the tree. Now, how would we do that? How would the brain figure out the causes of its sensory data? How are we going to do this inference problem, it's called in mathematical statistics? And it turns out that there is, in fact, a absolutely optimal, mathematically correct, information theoretic way to do this. And it's called, might bring you back to school days, but it's called Bayesian inference. It's a little bit more complicated than what you learned at school, but essentially it's just basically probability theory. And roughly speaking, I'm not going to go through the maths here, but I'll give you kind of a hint, because it's actually very, very helpful. What we're trying to figure out is, what's the probability that I'm looking at a tree given the sensory data that's coming through my eyes, okay? Now, that turns out to be a difficult thing to do, but there is, as I said, a correct way to do it, which is, weirdly, you turn this problem upside down. You try to say, well, that's going to be equal to, what's the probability of seeing this particular sensory data if it indeed were a tree that I was looking at, times the prior probability of seeing a tree in the first place. In other words, before I know what any data is, how likely are trees? Is this the kind of thing that I've grown up to see? Is this the type of thing that I have priors about? So this is the prior probability of trees. And this thing here, the probability of the data given the tree, is the likelihood of the data. So these are very, very important. You might think, well, why are we doing this if we're studying meditation? But it turns out that it's really kind of important. Hiding in here, for example, just to give you some motivation that I'm going to go with this, all your samskaras and karmas will be here, okay? So, and then it's divided by the probability of seeing, this is a normalizing term, the probability of seeing this data, or how rare is this data, The problem is actually that turns out to be what's called computationally explosive. We can't solve it analytically, except in very simple systems. In fact, in general, there isn't enough computational power in the whole universe to solve it for what you're doing right now. And so both for biological beings like us and in artificial intelligence, you have to have a workaround. How are we going to do this? So this is the basic problem. How are we going to figure out what we're seeing? How does the brain do this magic trick? And then we're going to say, well, what's the magic of perception and consciousness? So we'll come to that. Now, to get a hint of how to do this, we're going to go to artificial neural networks, which are kind of, give us, there's a wonderful thing. I actually worked in AI partly because I wanted to understand how the brain works, and the brain is just too difficult. So what we need to do is do simpler model systems that have to fundamentally solve the same problems as we do. And it gives us hints. In fact, some of the hints that come out of artificial intelligence have gone back into neuroscience and have in fact informed this whole new area of predictive processing and the free energy principle that I work in. So this is a typical neural network. Now, what does that mean? These are kind of neurons, they're kind of mathematical objects, but you can also think of them, the basic idea of these artificial neurons were coming from neurons in the brain. And you have a network where data, for example, the pixel values that's coming through your eyes, or data comes in from the bottom of the network. And each neuron is connected to every other neuron in the layer above, and every other neuron is connected up. And each of these weights, these are called synaptic weights, so just like in the brains, connections between neurons are synapses. And in this way, the neural network can do a marvelous thing, kind of sort of nonlinear transformation. And what you would ideally like is if you put lots of data in here, for example, what's coming through my eyes, I would like one of these neurons to kind of light up and say, it's a tree. So, bing. Or it's a dog, or it's a cat. Now, how do we train this? How do we train these kind of neural networks? Well, with computers, with image recognition, we're very fortunate, because what happens is that we put lots of data. We put a dog data, you put cat data, you put, a million different images, for example, and you see initially the network is just random. It hasn't learned anything. It's like a baby. And as the baby evolves, what happens is it starts making mistakes, or it starts getting it right. So, for example, you could put in a picture and it says, it's a cat, but in fact it's a dog. And that's a prediction error. That's a mistake. So in fact, the true value is a dog, and it's a cat. So there's a kind of an error signal. And what we do in a very clever mathematical algorithm called backpropagation, don't use the details of that, but you basically use kind of a calculus algorithm to adjust all these synaptic weights. So it's kind of like neuroplasticity. So you adjust all these synapse weights slowly, and so next time it'll be a little bit more likely to get it right, that it's a dog rather than a cat. And so as you do this, and as you train it with millions of images, because we know the ground truth, so we can give it an error signal, this network eventually becomes extremely good at recognizing. And of course, more than, I think it's almost 10, 12 years ago, they became better than humans, okay, at recognizing images, which is quite amazing, because humans are quite good, even at faces, and humans are really good at faces. So that's great, but can you spot the problem here? We can't do this in the brain. And the reason is because there is no supervisor in the brain to tell us it's really a dog or it's really a cat. There's no supervisor in the brain to give us ground truth. In fact, think about it. How do we ever get ground truth, right? Everything that we've ever experienced, everything we think we've learned from our parents, has all just happened through our sensory experience. So how are we going to solve this problem? This is amazing. I mean, this is really a tough issue. And it's not just a tough issue in neural network theory and how the brain works. It's the fundamental issue that philosophers have been thinking about for 3,000 years. This is what Plato talked about. This is, how can we know reality? This is the ultimate nature of ontology. This is what Immanuel Kant talked about. So, but there is one kind of ground truth that we do know. Really, it's interesting. There's one truth that we know, which is the data itself. That's interesting. So we know that that's true. We receive data. That's all we got. Now, how are we going to do that? What's the trick? Well, there's a marvelous trick that we stumbled across in AI and in machine learning, but evolution got there far before us. And evolution basically said, well, we got this data. We think we've learned what it might be. Let's, on the basis of our guess of what it might be, like a dog or a cat or a tree, let's then simulate what we might see. Okay, so what we do is do another neural network above with all these neurons And what this does is say, well, if it was indeed, for example, a tree, it runs it kind of backwards. It's called a generative model. And what you get out here are what you would expect to actually see, the pixels that you would actually expect to see, right? Like a picture. And what might that be looking like? Well, for example, you might see a tree. And then, how are we going to train this network? How are we going to learn as a baby? What we're going to do is we're going to use the ground truth that we know. We know, so this is the output of our simulation. This is called the generative model. So the output of our generative model are these pixels. It's actually a very good model. It's a complete model. It's actually a lot better than our data. But we're then going to compare the output of our generative model with the few bits of sensory data that I actually got. And we're going to find a prediction error. And with that prediction error, we're then going to adjust all the knobs and dials and synaptic weights and what we think it is, and in fact, this recognition network as well. We're going to train the entire stack of neural connections to minimize the difference between the data and what we think is going on, what we can actually picture, the generative model. And that way, we minimize prediction error. And there's a fancy term that's used occasionally called free energy. It's kind of to do with information theoretic ways. So this is the way the brain actually works, except that there's one problem. This is just too difficult as well. You can't do this. And the reason is because there are too many possibilities. It's just unfathomably huge to try to do this. What we need is to constrain what we are expecting to see. We should constrain our representations, the features of the world, and we're going to constrain them by priors. So, for example, I said we're quite likely to see trees. We've grown up seeing trees. And so the prior probability of a tree is kind of high. And when data looks roughly like a tree, you'll see a tree. It'll generate a tree, and then you're giving yourself a kind of bias to perceive the world in a certain way. And these priors are going to constrain this. Now you might ask, where do these priors come from? I mean, they're the magic. Well, turns out that the brain has a whole lot of these networks, and they come from another network, another model further up, a higher level model further up. And priors for that come from another model. And they're models all the way up. We don't know how many layers there are. It's kind of arbitrary to decide how many levels of models there are, but there might be something like 5 or 6 levels, 7 or 8 maybe. And they are all specialized. And so what happens is that we have this beautiful way of now figuring out what's going on. And here is the real magic. This is called the neurophenomenological hypothesis, which is what we actually see, what we're conscious of, is the output of the generative model. We never see the data. We actually never, ever see the data. We never see what's coming through our eyes. Now, actually, this isn't quite how it works in the brain. How it actually works in the brain is very interesting. This, I can't quite do it here, but this top generative model folds back on top. Okay, so this is a recognition model, this is a generative model. This generative model actually folds back on top. So this is where the data comes in. For those of you who know a little bit of neuroscience, sort of the early, for example, in visual, it'll be V1, where the visual cortex, the beginning, primary visual cortex. And the generative model actually goes down. So the brain is filling in the data from the top. It's not receiving data. It's actually filling in the pixels from the top, mostly. Now, this was really an amazing thing. We got this all upside down. If you ask neuroscientists 20 years ago, they would say, well, how does the brain work? Well, we get some data and then we process it and then eventually we figure out what's going on. No, that's not what's going on at all. What's going on, and I don't need to tell you this is now, as meditators, you're going to go, well, yeah, great, this is right. What's going on is that, in fact, we are generating an internal construction, an internal simulation of what's going on, and then we're just using the data to change the knobs and dials of our simulation to minimize prediction error. And then, of course, there are many ways to interpret the data, which is why we can have many experiences. Different people can have different experiences in the same circumstances. And one of the most amazing pieces of evidence for this is that it was always a mystery why there were 10 times as many feedback neurons as there were feed-forward neurons in the brain. I mean, that's really crazy. Like the data's coming in, and yet the neurons seem to be pointing in the wrong direction, like 10 times as many. And that's because the generative model, where, basically 10 times as much computation is happening to generate what I think is going on, is the feedback connections. So this is really interesting. This should tell you that, okay, this kind of assumption of naive realism that we're seeing the world or that we're trying to figure out what's going on. No, this is not really what's going on. And in fact, we have I'm actually enjoying this low-tech stuff. I really love this. So we have figured out how the brain does this and what the models look like. It's amazing. This little thing here is, roughly speaking, how the brain works, okay? You have this hierarchy. So let me go through, because not everyone will see this. So and this data, by the way, I'm showing you how the brain works. I mean, this is now a kind of getting to be more and more of a consensus in neuroscience. This particular schema was figured out using 17,000 fMRI studies, so pretty much most of neuroscience, and using machine learning to figure out what the hierarchy of computation is. And what we find is that I told you that you have these stacks of models upon models upon models, where, and what are these models? Well, the first layer, the bottom layer, are the somatosensory, your basic sensations. And as meditators, you might have gone down to these very, very fine level sensations, basic sensations, vibrotactile sensations, prosodic, which is kind of not even at the level of words, but below phonemes, the actual level of the auditory processing. Muscular, so these are very basic sensations that come up. And then you get things like basic emotions and gestures and voice. And the next level, you get emotion and rotation, and then you get the body map and faces and memories and deception. Deception is kind of a high level thing that goes on. And then right at the top, we have concepts, reasoning, abstraction, language. Now, the priors go down this way. So our conceptual understanding influences how we see, how we interpret our memories, how we interpret faces, how, the body map that we have. You could have body dysmorphia. You've got something going on. You've got a wrong conceptual map, and then you get a kind of wrong body map going on. And then you get motion and rotation and emotions. And unfortunately, most people live right up here, right up, in here. And, being meditators, you will also recognize that somewhere up here, we're also going to essentially, I'll talk about this later, we're going to come to a self model, because we haven't talked about the self. So the self is also going to be generated in this whole thing. And the priors are generated from each level down to the next. So each level is providing priors for the layer below, and then what comes up is prediction errors. So, we could have a prior that, this person who's wearing red always annoys me and whatever, and then I see annoyance on their face. I kind of just see, oh yeah, the data is just about compatible with the angry face. So the face are actually perceived. Remember that neurophenomenological hypothesis. The face that arises out of the generative model is in fact an irritated face. And so the priors come down there, the data or the prediction errors go up that way. And this is how we generate the world. So let's go back to our tree here. So we have a nice tree, and we're looking at the tree. Now, this is our generative model. So let's just put a little thought bubble. And what's in our thought bubble? What do we construct? Well, we construct a kind of portfolio of arisings coming out of all of this with abstract concepts. So, for example, we'll have, the first thing we'll see is we'll see a representation of a tree. I'm going to be generating a concept of a tree. But I'm also going to be generating, thoughts like blah, blah, blah. All right? Or not just auditory thoughts, but visual thoughts. I don't know, I'd be thinking about going to an umbrella on the beach or something. We'll be having emotions, not very happy. We'll be having body sensations from our viscera. We'll be feeling, how our heartbeat is going. Maybe, what's going on in our gut. We will be hearing sounds. And most importantly, we'll also have a sense of self. Because after all, look at this. This is my experience, and I perceive a body here, connected to my body sensations. And it makes sense in this world. In fact, there's a kind of perspectivalness, like I'm looking at the world from me right now here. Everything is in polar coordinates. Everything is a certain number of meters over there and a certain angle over there, right? It's all based around me here. This is amazing that we create a generative model with all of this details so that we can actually make sense of the world. So somehow I'm simulating myself, but not just simulating a sense of like this avatar that's here, but also simulating the emotions in the avatar, but also simulating a kind of a narrative about myself. So I've got a narrative self, I've got an agent, like I am the doer, I'm the one who's actually putting that down there. It's like it's my action that did it. There's a narrative self, there's a perspectival self, there's a social self, there's all this stuff that goes into building the self. And we now call this a phenomenal self-model. So this has to be constructed within ourselves. And this phenomenal self-model has all these kind of volitions and actually has priors about the kind of world it would like. For example, the prior is, I shouldn't be dehydrated. I should drink some water, right? I mean, and what it's going to do is going to make me feel discomfort, and then I'll drink water. And then I'll move closer to homeostasis, and that will go away. And so all of this, these are actually, it's interesting, like you might have noticed that I've called these reward signals or pain signals also are the priors, that we don't like to be in pain. We want to be closer to the things that we are attracted to. So there is this complex generative world model. In fact, the term that sometimes uses phenomenal generative world model. And guess what? That's what you're experiencing right now. Now, it's a very strange thing because, you know, as meditators, like, you'll say, well, I mean, if you ask people, where are you aware from? Most people will say, I'm kind of aware from maybe somewhere behind my eyes. But that's very strange, isn't it? Because this entire thing is part of my phenomenal generative world model, and it's arising within my awareness, yeah. And yet, somehow, I feel like I'm aware from somewhere behind my eyes. And yet, this is all happening within awareness. This is a kind of a cool trick here. It is a trick called reification. Reification is when we take it to be reality. We sort of forget, well, we don't forget because we might not have recognized it in the first place, but the game evolution wants to play with us is, this is actually your reality, and it's a super helpful data structure. Why is it a helpful data structure? Because I can run away. If I know where I am, and I know what everything is happening, and there's a lion coming over there, I can run away that way. It's very easy for me to compute what to do. I know what to do to get the apple, to get away from danger, to get to food and find a mate and all those kind of things. I know exactly how to survive. So this is a very helpful data structure. But evolution wants us to take it very seriously, and it's called naive realism. The philosophical position is called naive realism. Now, meditation can help us to start to examine this experience, and we can start to deconstruct it. We can start to see that this is a fabrication. And we do this in several ways. The first kind of major family of meditation techniques is an attentional family, and it's really calming, shamatha meditation. So we quieten all this. So what we do is we generally tend to quieten everything that's going on here. How do we do that? Well, we might do that by, for example, paying attention, this is my nose, and paying attention to breath at my nose. Now, what that does is it takes up the bandwidth for my entire generative world model, and the bandwidth adds up to 100%. And the allocation for all these levels of experience, in fact, there's a technical term for it, it's called precision weighting, but don't worry about that. But what happens is that we can actually downweight all of these, quieten all of these other things that are going on by putting 80%, 90% of our attention on the breath at the nose. Now, what that's doing, interestingly, is somewhere down here are sensations of breath at the nose. And so you are allocating precision weighting down here at the basic somatosensory levels. And so you're putting kind of 90% awareness here. And therefore, what happens is something magic, which is all the thinking and being stuck up in yourself and thinking about all this other stuff gets downweighted to 10%. So it becomes very quiet. Now that's very helpful. So first of all, we're quietening the whole scene. And then what we start to do, and this is already doing it at breath of the nose, but you can investigate any one of these sensations areas, just examine body sensations. And what you find is that all of this starts to turn off or quieten. Certainly the weight, the precision weighting, or the kind of attention reduces at the top level. And then at some stage, you might notice that your body map is hardly there. All you can feel is this buzzing, blooming cloud of sensations, and it's no longer organized around a body map because the body map is somewhere up here. And we can start to deconstruct. And when we deconstruct, we see that all of these things that we took to be, for example, our arm, are actually fabricated. This arm is fabricated. And when I don't tune into the arm, but I tune into the basic sensations, the arm disappears. And of course, we can take this whole journey down even beyond towards very powerful experiences of like a cessation or a nirvikalpa samadhi or something like this. And you can really get the idea that, in fact, all of it is constructed and you don't have to have any constructions. Now, so let's see what happens in meditation. Let's imagine that we quieten all of these, we close our eyes, we quieten, we pay attention to the breath of our nose, and even the breath of our nose essentially becomes unfabricated, and it's kind of a sparkling, flitting sensations that are almost undefinable. Now, what can then happen is, especially as we bring awareness, we allow awareness to free itself, is that we might notice something else that we missed in this picture. And that is, we might notice the entire space itself, the entire perceptual space, the space in which everything arises. This is the space of the generative model itself. So suddenly we can recognize the space of the generative model itself, not the contents, not any of the contents, but this space of the generative model itself is empty, still, silent. In fact, even the idea of physical space is just an arising, or is just a construction within this. So it's boundless. It doesn't even have space. In fact, and this is where it really gets very deep, time arises within the generative model. Things happen, tick, tock, tick, one happening after another. That beats out time. But that's arising within this space of the generative model, this awareness. And at that stage, everything, there is no duality. You're not looking at it from this avatar's perspective, this phenomenal self-model's perspective. what you've woken up to is the non-dual awareness in which everything arises. And that's a really interesting thing. Now, I'll just say this because I know there's a lot of advanced people here. And so even that awareness, if it's made a thing of, is a little fabrication. This is very skillful. So I would say no one should be scared of awareness. One should just go with whatever approximation to awake awareness we can find. But even that is not a thing. Even that is empty. And so it can get very deep. And this kind of space of perception, this emptiness, has been called luminous. Why luminous? Because it's the space that lights up all arisings. It's that which can have the capacity to know. So this kind of luminous, empty space has been, when we try to find metaphors for it, there are metaphors that are used in the traditions. One of the most beautiful is the sky. So you are the sky in which everything arises, all the clouds and all the weather and all that kind of stuff. And somehow this sky is unaffected by whatever weather is going on in the system. And that is very important because that is pure equanimity. Because I don't like this tree, it's going to give me hay fever, it's irritating, is arising within awareness. The space itself has none of that. So its nature is pure peace, pure stillness, pure equanimity. But it has another nature as well, which is it allows anything to arise. It's infinitely giving, it's infinitely fertile. And that is also very beautiful, and that can be perceived as a kind of a love. Very strange thing to come out of a generative phenomenal model. Now, what we have figured out in the last, by this kind of, in the last 20 or 30 years, in this kind of an analysis, is that these great philosophical traditions and contemplative traditions, what they were describing was in fact exactly where we think we end up with in now, by describing this epistemic space, the space that has the capacity to know. And this has been called pure awareness, this has been called Rigpa, this has been called the Buddha nature, this has been called the peace that passes understanding. When people discover this for the first time, they're kind of discovering that what they took to be waves, all these objects are just waves, is in fact a whole ocean. So this is another analogy which I think is very useful. And now this ocean that we've discovered, this space, there's another level that we need to go to, because we now look at, well, what about the tree? And what about the emotions? And what about the visceral sensations and the thoughts? They are also just modulations of that awareness space. And so they're no different from the fundamental substrate of the generative model, the ocean itself. So then there's this second phase of discovery that we go through, and you may even go through this before as you start to deconstruct, which is that you notice that all the objects in the world that you took to be reified, that you took to be a real pen, are in fact just arisings of your awareness. and so are they reified. So they are also just awareness. It's just that they're dancing awareness, and this is still awareness. So just like the ocean is still ocean, and then the waves on top of the ocean. So what we'll do is maybe take a little break, and what we'll do is a little guided meditation, and then we'll come back to exploring the deeper implications of this framework. Okay, so let's all relax and close your eyes. You can, if you don't feel comfortable, close your eyes. Absolutely fine to have them open as well. One of the most important things to notice as we meditate is that this reification that I was talking about, this object formation, is a kind of a gripping, is a kind of a tension. So what can be very helpful to start a meditation is really to relax. Relax your whole body. Relax your neck. You can move it around. Relax your shoulders. Relax your torso, your back. You can move your hips. Make sure that there's no tension there. Relax your thighs and your calves and your feet. Relax your arms. Relax your hands. Your arms are so relaxed that they're like wet rags. And we just observe whatever's going on. Just check out the weather in the body. There might be movement in the chest, in the stomach. There might be sensations. Allow everything. Just be like the sky. Be like the sky, allowing everything to come and go. Noticing the whole body all at once, from the top of your head to your feet. Feeling the pressure where you're sitting, the feet on the ground. And within that bodyscape, allowing everything to happen, you might notice a movement of the breath, just subtly inflating the whole body and deflating the whole body like a lung or a balloon. We're just going to place 5% of our awareness on this breath movement, and 95% we're just going to be the sky in which everything's arising. So there's a still sky with a very quiet inflation and deflation from the breath. And you might notice that every time you breathe in, there's a slight energization of the body. Maybe you feel an aliveness in the energy in the body, slight increase in vibration or the intensity. And every time we breathe out, there's a relaxation, a letting go. And you might notice that what you take your body to be is filled with subtle sensations. And if you look to the edges of your body, you see that their edges are not really there. They're not sharp. They're just ideas or constructions. But as you feel your energy, there is no edge to the body. And as you notice that there's no edge to the body, you notice that the awareness of your body is actually boundless. Your body sensations occupy the whole space of perception. And as you maintain awareness of your body and body sensations, come to notice sound. And come to notice that this sound is arising right on top of the body sensations. The body sensations are boundless, and the sound is happening in the same space as your body sensations. And that there is no distinction between inside and outside. They're all happening on top of each other in the space of perception. Just rest as that space and allow everything to arise. Sensations, sounds. See if you can find any boundaries. Any boundaries between inside and outside your body. The awareness is boundless, spacious. And notice that the sounds are arising out of this spacious awareness. But the spacious awareness is absolutely still and silent. There's a silence underneath all sounds. And there's a stillness underneath all motion, all vibrations, all change. As you rest as this awareness, see if you can notice if you're coming from somewhere, who's aware, what is aware. See if you can find where you're aware from. If you think you found where you're aware from, who's aware of that? Who or what is aware of that? And then if you think you found that, ask the question again. Who or what is aware of that? Find the looker. Don't worry about the intellectual side of it, just actually look and search. If there's any part of you that feels like the you, the I, go there. And then ask, who's looking at that? Just relax and allow everything to arise. Notice all the energies that just come and go. Sensations, sounds. Notice what they're made of. Notice that they're not different from the still, silent, spacious, timeless awareness. And now gently return to the body and feel yourself grounding. Feel the pressure of the contact of your body against the chair and the floor. And you can gently open your eyes and notice that nothing has changed, that the distinction between inside and outside is also as it was when your eyes were closed. That this entire scene is illuminated by awareness. Okay. Good. All right, so let's have a little vote. Who would like to go further, maybe towards a mystical leap? And who would like to have Q&A? So for those who want to go further. Yeah? And Q&A? Yeah? Okay. So we'll go a little further, but we'll reserve a good amount of time for Q&A. So we haven't talked about the nature of reality. We've just talked about your experience. But this is, I would say, probably the most important level of awakening, to awaken to the nature of your experience. And that so-called higher levels of awakening, actually a lot of the benefits come at this first level of awakening. And I'll talk a little bit to say that there is even a view that so-called higher levels of awakening are just really all just the first level of awakening. But we'll get there. But everyone's interested in, like, what is this? What is this universe? What's going on here? Like, okay, so we talked about my awareness. What we have just figured out is that I am not the little ego, phenomenal self-model within my awareness. If I'm anything, I'm either nothing or I am my awareness. Fine, there's two ways people talk about it, no self or true self. But that true self, capital S self, is the entire space. And for those of you, there are many, there's a kind of a long discussion of this no self, true self discussion, but really this level of awakening is, you might describe it as the Atman level. This is kind of the Indian, the Vedanta word for the true nature of the self. Not the ego, but really the nature of self. But there is something else now that we need to think about, which is, well, what is reality then? I mean, you could take that view and then philosophically you could just say, well, I don't know anything else, so maybe there's nothing else and this is all just within my own dream, and that's called solipsism. But solipsism is not very satisfying. It's also rather problematic from an information theoretic perspective. Don't know how we contain so much information in the brain. So most of us really want to go further. And Immanuel Kant talked about this fundamental problem that all we know is our phenomenal world, the world that we experience. What is the noumenal world? The world as it is in itself. And it might be of an entirely different nature. We don't know. What we know is that somehow we're resonating with it. Like a flag. Imagine a flag Now, the flag only knows itself, and it knows the motion within its own fabric. And then it thinks, what is the wind? And it thinks that the wind is kind of somehow this movement that it feels in its fabric. But actually, the wind is kind of completely different. It's like air. The flag doesn't even know what air is. So this is a big issue in philosophy. But there is, well, first of all, let's introduce more people here. Let's have someone else. And now, she's also got a world model with a tree, and now there's her, and there's also someone else looking at the tree. And, I mean, can I have someone else? And now there's him, and there's someone else on that side, someone on that side. Different perspectives. We all have our different perspectives and ways of interpreting, different priors, as I said, different ways of looking. And they're all going to be perspectival. In fact, every being, every dog and cat would have its own world perspective, its own generative model. And let's look at the quality of the awareness in each of these models. There is nothing special. There is no property that is unique to me about my awareness. Anything that is arising, any property that is arising within my awareness. And so the first thing to notice is that this awareness is empty. And emptiness, the clue is in the word, it's empty. It is the space in which experience arises. It has no qualities. The qualities that we talked about, peace and love and things like that, are a consequence of being that emptiness. It's the generosity to allow all experience. Now, all of this is the same awareness, but then there's something more. There is that, well, if our awareness is not different, okay, so we're having the same awareness, but what is reality? What is reality made of? And this is where the next mystical leap comes, which was that the nature that we ourselves are part of reality. So this was a great insight by Schopenhauer after Kant, who says, well, Kant, you're an amazing philosopher, but there's one thing you didn't notice, which is that whilst we can only experience the phenomenal world, who or what is experiencing that phenomenal world is part of reality. We ourselves are part of reality. And so we are the noumenal. We are the ultimate nature of reality. And what is the nature of our reality? It is this empty, luminous space. And so the mystical leap is in fact that the whole of reality is in fact one ultimate nature of reality, and that it is one entire system. There is just the universe going on, and the universe is having multiple perspectives on itself. There's a part of the universe, there is the whole universe having a perspective from one perspective, and the whole universe having a perspective from another perspective. And so there are these perspectives of the one on the one. Now, this level, you might describe it as the kind of Brahman level, where it's that the Atman, your true self, was in fact the ultimate true, the self of the universe, the awareness which is the entire universe. Or I won't use the word awareness, you could just use the word the nature of the entire universe. And so this is the kind of next level. And I know I'm bringing this out because, many people will feel like, but there's more here. And there is more here. But now remember, I'm now going to really mess with you because we've just told ourselves a story. And this story is just an arising within our awareness. And so, you can chew on that to see if it's a deeper awakening or it's another story. And in fact, this story, which is around the nature of how the brain constructs our reality with all those different levels and precision weighting and prediction error minimization and all that, is a very good story, I think, because if you go deep enough, it allows us to notice the nature of our awareness and that it can start to guide us in, for example, how to develop practices that are more conducive to awakening. So that's a little bit about the mystical leap. And then if you want to know more about, all the things like the priors and where they come from, and then how you start basically liberating those priors. And we've talked about awakening a lot here, but there's a whole dimension of liberation, which is loosening of those priors, essentially noticing that they're de-reified, and so that they start to unwind as patterns in your mind, in your brain. That's another level. We're going to cover a lot of this material in the course, so this is just a taster of what you've had. There'll be a lot deeper stuff and a lot more in the science on liberation and things. But let's go to Q&A. All right.
You're working? Yeah. We're all just making up stories, right? And it's so the teacher Rob Bebea talked about soulmaking, right? Which is I always see it as a kind of emptiness, the sequel, right? It's kind of like, okay, well, what next, right? And then it's all just dance, right? It's all just art. And when I see the story that you laid out for us before, it seems like a form of art and a form of dance that's just, we're not going to find anything ultimately from it, but it's just beautiful. And I'm wondering if you see it in the same way.
I absolutely do. So the question was very pertinent and prescient, in fact, I'll explain, which was we talk about these stories, and Rob Bebea, a beloved Dharma teacher at Gaia House, who died a few years ago, talks about after emptiness, there is this dance of stories, and just to make it beautiful. And of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, Rob was one of the main influences in my life. I mean, I've had a number of influences. I've kind of gone more non-dual, Michael Taft, but definitely I find that Rob Bebea's Dharma is really the meta-Dharma. It is actually the way I see it. I think he absolutely got this right. Emptiness is the universal acid of the spiritual path. This is, the fundamental de-reification of all things. But then what do you do from there? What is this? Well, you could make a story that there's no self, or you could make a story that I am pure awareness, or you could make a story that I am Brahman. You could make a story that there's no story, let's just dance and make this cool thing. We know it's a construction. There's all sorts of stories. There is a way of recognizing and waking up within this and saying, yes, but it's still a beautiful, important world, and let's not mess it up. Let's stop polluting it. Let's do something. Let's make it more beautiful. Let's actually alleviate suffering. Let's allow the entire dance of existence to flourish. So that's where I am. I think that's exactly right. I think that you'll learn a lot more about this on the course. I talk in the course about after the deconstruction, which is what we talked about today a little bit, there's the reconstruction, which is essentially what Rob calls soul making. But I put it in these kind of computational neurophenomenological terms. So we see how to reconstruct our priors in beautiful ways. First of all, how to deconstruct them, how to go into reprogramming mode, and then how to construct beautiful priors and the landscapes. And we'll talk about attractor basins in the free energy landscape, and check out this area, and let's check out compassion, and let's check out Sufi awe and reverence. So I love it. Yeah, great.
Can I ask two related questions? So the first one is, how does this predictive model that we seem to have as a brain, which is quite flawed and, well, not necessarily flawed, but it kind of uses the priors, it sounds like it uses priors before, or weights them more than the data that it gets. How does the split happen where, well, we have this, right? We can't escape it. And how does it happen that sometimes some people split from it and realize that it is something to go beyond, and most of us, even those who do split from it, most of the time we are trapped in it. So I guess my question is, what is that click? Is there any insight you have on like how did that split happen? And the other related question is, I've been constantly having that tension between awakening as escapism, where it's so much more peaceful than life, versus embodiment and actually living. Like, and sometimes I'm in that sense of like, I'm here to literally feel the pain and work through it. It's messy, but then that escapism. Well, it doesn't feel like escapism, if I'm honest. Like meditating, it just feels like I have a distance between it. But that very distance means that there is a duality, right? You're either in the show or you're watching it. And what is your view on that?
Yeah, okay, great. Two really wonderful questions. I'll try to summarize a little bit about them as I do the questions. The first question was around how can we really, we're constructing our world using priors and data. How can we not do that? I mean, how could we live our lives in a way without it? And I think the answer is that no, we actually will continue to construct the world. The art, I think, is two things. One is emptiness, which is that to know that these constructions are just that this is just an arising, it's a beautiful arising. And the second is, how do we want to construct it? Which is the soul making, which is reconstructing ourselves. So I think that, and it's related to the second question, which I'll just quickly summarize, and then I'll start to answer both of them together, which is that should we not just check out and remain within pure awareness, go to a Himalayan cave and just sit in equanimity or joy or love or happiness? Why do we come back into the world, and what's the point of it? And I think this is really important, and especially, as you say, around that there are things to deal with, our dysfunctional patterns, the suffering in the world, We don't want to just run away from that. And that really is the deep end of the practice, I think. And what you're asking is a really, I think, a never-ending, quest, really, which is the view from the absolute and the view from the relative. Just hanging out in the absolute is denying the relative, and yet, just being back in the relative, you're missing something as well. And this is something that, as spiritual teachers become, more advanced, they really grapple with this more and more. And I say that there is nowhere to stand here. A few of you might know one of the most amazing pieces of wisdom I know is Ram Dass's explanation of this. He sort of describes how his guru says, Ram Dass, can't you see that everything's perfect? And Ram Dass goes, perfect? What about all the starving kids in Uganda? I mean, this is terrible. How is this perfect? And then his guru says, can't you step back from your humanity and see that it's exactly all perfect? And Ram Dass really wrestles with this, and he goes through this, and ultimately where he ends up is that we have to hold both. That there is no ultimate synthesis. The way I put it, and the way I find, is that our existential situation is to be, or in Christian terms, our existential situation is to be God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. In other words, our existential situation is to be the infinite and the finite. And that's our dance. That's the dance of Shiva, I think. Playing this relative instantiation, this relative world, knowing that how can I make this particular expression of the infinite beautiful? And that's why you might want to, clean up and work on your patterns, because you don't want to make everyone all upset and cause misery around the place. And might want to do something like paint some beautiful things and do other things in life. This is a way of dancing beautifully, but knowing, one of the great spiritual symbols is this dancing Shiva. He's got one hand here with this kind of drum of birth, and one hand here, the fire of destruction. Through birth and death, through joy and sorrow, this hand here is a hand of blessing, but it really is, everything is okay. So through the ups and downs of life, through the relative, through all the trials and tribulations, it's all okay. It's that existential situation of not being able to land in the infinite or the finite, of having both. That's a real dance. So that's how to answer that.
So thank you very much for explanation and the model. And I'm listening to this, and I see that the model develops itself and develops some priors on the influences, different influences. But you saying that we should not give up, should strive. But who's striving? Who's not giving up? And what's the point? I mean, how this process happens.
Beautiful. Yeah. So the question is, sounds like we should be going for something, we should be meditating, we should be kind of going on the path to awakening, to liberation. But who's striving? Who's actually doing any of this? And this is a really beautiful and subtle point. And of course, there are traditions, there are ways, which is precisely The direct path is nothing to do, there's nowhere to go. This is it. Now, the issue is there still suffering if, after that? The alternative is to work within the relative, because actually the strange thing is that awakening is a project for the ego. Okay, but that's okay. That's like, let's work with that. Let's know that. Of course, in one sense, it will be a kind of a disappointment for the ego, because Shiva's dance still goes on. There'll be ups and downs and whatever. So the whole process from the progressive path is a slow process of seeing things more and more empty. By empty, I mean that they are not seen as real, they're not reified, they're seen as mental constructions. As such, they start to lose their grip over us, their kind of push and pull. And so there's more equanimity around everything. And that whole process it's a really long process. There can be this process of immediate grasping and a glimpse of awakening, but then the next moment is like, oh, you're caught up because someone did something and you're caught. And so there's this whole dance of awakening more and more, broadening one's awakening in a wider and wider situation, and having more and more liberation. In other words, the patterns that still grip you. So I'll draw up we'll cover more of this in the course if anyone's interested in this kind of, this dynamic between the progressive path and the direct path. This is what we'll cover in the course as well. But there's two dimensions. There's no such word as enlightenment in the original Eastern traditions. The words were boga, or the word was for awakening, boga, which is roughly where Buddha comes from, and moksha, which is liberation. And so which is being liberated from the bondage of our patterning, our samsara. And that's about loosening one's, these patterns that grip, that cause you to kind of crave or have aversion, and then it's really important, I can't, this is really getting to me. No, you can just see this as an arising. Now, so there can be, for example, an initial awakening where you get a clarity, and that allows for more patterns, because there's so much equanimity. Essentially, the Tibetans would call it self-liberating energies. So patterns arise, they're allowed to flow through, and there's no reaction, and so they start to unwind. This is called, in neuroscience, we call this extinction therapy. So this is how we get rid of phobias. Essentially, just like people are scared of spiders. You put a spider over there, and you're relaxed, it's very far away, and then you realize, I saw a spider, I didn't react, and then the pattern of that stimulus response pattern is slightly weakened, and then the spider gets closer and closer. So this kind of deconditioning is exactly the kind of process that goes on in liberation. So what happens is that you get more liberation. And then as there's more liberation, there's more equanimity all over. And so there's more ability to just be in awakening. So the awakening broadens. And then that causes more liberation. Now, so there is this path that goes towards it. Now, if you have an awakening upfront heavy path. This is sometimes called the direct path, or and if you have a liberation heavy front, which is you work on purification, you sit in meditation, in a kind of a dualistic meditation. A lot of early Buddhism is like this. Do a lot of purification, and there's a lot of liberation. But it's kind of coming from dualism, and then suddenly, because there's so much liberation, when the awakening happens, it takes off. And so you could argue that there is no shortcut here in terms of, personally, I don't think there's an end point. So this is my own bias. Now, there are lots of people who say, no, but, XYZ person, like that mid-20th century saint, he was the business and whatever. I think our priors go really deep. I think our priors go all the way through to beyond the brainstem, even into the physiology of the body. I think we have a prior around homeostatic control of our glucose. And I think that we're going to have these patterns. That's why I kind of more about how do we reconstruct ourselves, the art of the possible. That's the existential situation. So I don't believe in any kind of perfectionism, but I do think that these are kind of different ways of looking at it. And it is skillful to do progressive practice. So I will say that for all the great Neo-Advaita direct path who's there to strive, the thing that I would advise at the end of the day, you can take this or leave this, is my final advice is just meditate every single day. Don't miss a day, through thick or thin, ups and downs. If you're flying to Tokyo, find a way to just meditate on the flight for half an hour. Just do it. Carry on. Now, yeah, that's my view, which is familiarize, because in a sense, when you say who's doing it, this is a really deep question that you posed, because take the absolute view, which is where your question was coming from. Well, it's all just happening. But if it's all just happening and this character happened to have fooled himself into meditating every day, then it's going to happen better.
So awakening is the project for the ego. From that premise, once we get a glimmer of awakening, I'd love you to unpack your perspective of moving beyond awakening from the meta consciousness layer of source, because from my experience glimmering on occasion in that non-dual emptiness, pushing through that is everything. So to me, it almost feels like an LLM of source consciousness, where we all have and contribute to the universal experience in these uplinks, and then we're downloading information from source consciousness from the realm of probabilistic outcomes based on who we are, not only our perspective, but our perhaps intergenerational perspective, genetic codes, which we can trace back to 16 generations, based on science is what our biology is actually doing, who we are, who we think we are. So moving beyond liberation and freedom, what would you share in terms of insights for us to embrace this incredible miracle that we get to be a part of and we get to co-create, so that we're not just doing this to self-soothe and get a break from the incessant reality of being human, but perhaps some of the creative element of what we can do with this power and this knowledge to move into the world to contribute to the scaling of incremental consciousness to becoming a more conscientious, omniconsiderate, non-dual perspective species, embracing Homo Deus from Homo sapien. What's next? What would you like to see? And any insights around that? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So, again, the question was similar to the themes that we had a little bit about. Is this all about checking out into the absolute, or is it about actually refining our view and using the creativity of the source to live a more powerful relative life that is somehow a beautiful instantiation of your potentiality. And so I think I've kind of given the game away, which is the similar theme, that I think that there is in spiritual communities this kind of understanding now that we need to return to the relative, and that there is this potential danger of what is called spiritual bypassing. I'm not a big fan of the spiritual bypassing, because the thing is that you can then kind of, as a teacher once said, like, there are all sorts of dangerous things that you can do with a fountain pen. You can use it to write beautiful novels, but you can also use it to poke your eye. So he said, so don't poke your eye. So in other words, don't bypass. Now, this is a tricky thing. This really is coming down to Ram Dass's point, which is, as he put it, how do you, on the one hand, know it's all perfect, and on the other hand, have your human heart open? Can you have your heart open in hell, is how he put it. And this is really, I think, very, very important, that coming back into this relative, knowing that our existential situation is that we are this particular energy nexus of the universe. But there is just actually the universe doing this. And yet, it's gone to all this effort to give us a sense of subjective self. In fact, it took 13.8 billion years to produce us. Like, wow, like, why waste that? What can we do with this amazing physiology and miraculous stuff? We look around at this ecosystem and, like, it's just this utter gift. So let's do something beautiful with it. Let's make it more beautiful. Let's participate in that process. So that's my own perspective, and how each person wants to do that, how each person becomes a beautiful expression of the infinite, is going to be down to their particular history, causes, conditions. Every one of us is got this unique constellation to dance a unique dance. And so another one, people who know me know that, I always say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We are the blooms of the universe, and each flower should be just this unique flower. So let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then we all go around and pick up many flowers and make a beautiful bouquet and say, look at that, and then that influences us, and then we bloom in a different way. This is the dance. So you have to find the way to make your bloom beautiful. Yeah.
This is a question from the Zoom chat, which I'll just read out. Also, I promised to give you a 10-minute warning, which is about now. So Paul asks, you referred to the Brahman insight that all awarenesses are facets of a unified whole as a story, and also described the neural network model as a story. But the latter has predictive power. It can drive cars and power systems like ChatGPT. So are they both really stories in exactly the same sense?
Okay, beautiful. This is like, it's a beautiful question. It's almost like a plant for me to talk about this. Yeah. Good. So let's just review this business of stories. In the European Enlightenment, driven out of the scientific revolution, so there was this idea of objective truth. Like, what is truth? We want to know the way things really are. Okay, and a typical analysis of what is truth, most people's common sense view of what is truth is something called the correspondence theory of truth. Some proposition P is true if and only if there corresponds a state of affairs in the world that makes P that P. Okay, now I know it's a bit complicated, but like basically, now the problem with that is how would we know whether there corresponds some state of the world that makes P true, that is that P. And so that has a real problem, which we talked about. We don't know. So then there started to be this a different type of theory of truth, which is called a coherence theory of truth, which is, look, we can't have, there is no objective way to find out what are the true beliefs stroke stories. So what we'll do is we'll have stories are beliefs are true if they cohere with each other. In other words, if they support each other, if they correspond to each other. So you have a series of beliefs and they are all mutually self-supporting. But then that sounds pretty good, right? But that's got a problem of the opposite nature to the correspondence theory of the truth, which is it's sort of free-floating from the world. Like, yeah, it doesn't help us have iPhones and drive cars and because it's so completely free-floating. And then by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, there started to emerge a new set of ideas around truth called the pragmatic theory of truth, which had the recognition that ultimately truth is a kind of a noble fiction. But it serves a very important purpose. So Charles Sanders Peirce was the first person to put this. He basically thought that truth are the kind of norms that we want to have in society to allow us to have a discourse. In other words, it's the end point of some sort of rational discourse. Now, William James then comes along and says, yeah, he sort of put it another way, which is like, truth is those stories that are useful, okay? So I won't go into kind of the details of this thing, but let me just propose that, so we started off with this modernism from the Enlightenment, and then we got this postmodern view, which is that, it's all stories, and everything is good as everything else. The problem with that is relativism. So there's nowhere to, so every story is as good as everything else. What do we do? That is not satisfying. It's not satisfying to our moral intuitions. It's not satisfying for science. It's not satisfying for all these things. And so then you get this meta-modern perspective, or which is a synthesis, which is that, okay, we really have to learn this lesson that, yeah, it's all stories, but some stories are better than other stories. But here I say, well, what's the criteria of betterness? Is that the ultimate truth? No, that's just another story, okay? But let me tell you what we as a society, let me propose and tell you what we as a society have converged on the norms of betterness of story. Number one, a story is a good story if it coheres with a lot of other good stories. So, for example, the story that witches float on or sink underwater is a terrible story because it kind of coheres with about 10 stories but doesn't cohere with billions of others, right? So coherence, we want stories that cohere, forming a web of beliefs. Number two, stories are good stories if they have empirical predictive value, which is something that the questioner asked about, which is that if we have a story and it allows us to predict our sensory data, because we only have our sensory data, then it's a good story. So in other words, priors that tend to predict our sensory data, that are good. We want to develop priors that are good stories. We want them to predict the sensory data. Otherwise, we'll be eaten by the lion. We won't get food. So that's the number 2. Coherence, number 1. Number 2 is empirical value. Number 3, stories are good stories if they are economical and parsimonious. In other words, if they're simple. So you had many stories in the Middle Ages about angels dancing on pinheads and explaining all sorts of things, but they were just over elaborate. You can now tell the story with far fewer variables using modern science. So that's called Occam's razor, for those of you into philosophy. So that's economical and parsimonious. Number 4, stories are good stories if they are pragmatically useful. In other words, if they're conducive to human flourishing. So this is very important. It's a good story if it allows us to flourish better. Not just flourish, for example, get us food, that certainly allows us to flourish. Avoid danger, yes. But if it's conducive to our flourishing, if it allows us to actually express, to develop our capacities excellently, so we can become really beautiful, shining, blooming flowers, of our capacities. So this is what I say are criteria for good stories. None of them are true in an absolute sense. They are all hanging off each other, but they form a kind of pragmatic basis. So this is what we call the irony that lies at the center of metamodernism. This is the spiritual territory. You're going to have to get used to groundlessness. It's a great question. I love it, and all for iPhones and making the world better and going to the moon and solving our environmental problems by using creative and innovative scientific ways.
Thank you so much. That was such a perfect segue into my question, actually, because it is about groundlessness. So let's say you had like a really crazy insight into emptiness, and then you're on a direct line, and you're just starting to go up, and you're in this like groundless state. I don't know. Are you familiar with the cloud of unknowing?
Yeah.
Yes. So my question is, in the cloud of unknowing, and then many other teachers in many different places, the message I think is that we should build our capacity to be in groundless states. Yeah, and I was wondering why is that, and if you can speak to it.
Great. Well, actually, that's a bit. So the question is around groundlessness and the cloud of unknowing, and around building our capacities to be in that groundless state. And why is it important? Actually, this is what we've really been talking about. Emptiness is the groundlessness. And the reason why we call the groundless ground is because just to balance the very, very beautiful and important wording that the ground of being is really lovely. The problem is that it makes people think that there is a ground, there's somewhere to stand. And as we talked about throughout this Q&A, there is nowhere to stand, neither in the absolute nor the relative, neither in objective beliefs of science or any other objective beliefs. There is nowhere to stand. And this is the sort of groundless ground. This groundless ground is really ultimately representing that empty luminosity, which actually has no thingness, no objectness, no property as in an object property. And that is, of course, a very scary place to be. People want to find somewhere to anchor. This is like a kind of a thing that, of course, our egos want to do, but ultimately it's always, there's some sort of grasping, you want to find somewhere, and it's very uncomfortable to be in groundlessness or paradox, or that there is no truth, or that there is, there's nowhere to stand, or that even the criteria for better stories are just other stories, or that I am not the absolute, or I am not the relative. Our existential situation is this groundless place of being within the Holy Trinity, or as in the Tibetans would put it, the Dharmakaya, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya, this kind of, again, the finite, the infinite, the form, the formless, and the archetypes. And so the reason we do that is because it is boundless freedom. So groundlessness is that boundless freedom. Any view, any constraint on it is a limitation. That empty luminosity's nature is boundless freedom. And it is the source of creativity. We heard about creativity. So, and by the way, none of this has to be like, it has to be kind of perfect. We're constantly approximating this. We're constantly having things that we didn't realize we were reifying. We go deeper and deeper and see, oh my gosh, it's even more groundless than I thought. Oh my gosh, it's even more groundless. So that's fine, but the reason we do that is to explore the nature of that freedom, I think. And for what? So there is no for what, because there's no objective answer, but I say, so let's make it beautiful, Yeah. Okay.
How does the psychedelic experience intersect?
Okay, good. So great short question, which is, how does the psychedelic experience intersect with this understanding and, I guess, the spiritual path? So I think psychedelics are really very powerful, and of course, therefore potentially dangerous, but very powerful technologies, psychotechnology. Just as meditation is a powerful psychotechnology, psychedelics are. So I work in psychedelics, and I worked on this rebus model, which talks about how psychedelics downweight those top-level priors that we talked about, the sort of conceptual top-level priors, and which allows to look at the world in a fresh way, unconstrained by our high-level beliefs, these high-level priors, these high-level beliefs, and therefore can potentially help understanding the nature of our freedom. Now, there's downsides as well, because, of course, you can deconstruct your priors and then construct new ones. And unless you get the insight into emptiness, you can actually strengthen your ego in a sense, because you can create new priors, but you haven't yet kind of grokked the fact that everything is a construction at a deep level. So this is a dance. Nevertheless, I honestly think that psychedelics, in my own journey, which I took very late in life, I meditated for 30 years before I did my first psychedelics. So which I would recommend, of course, because meditators are very, putting the two together is a very powerful way of dealing with it. But nevertheless, psychedelics can really help to open up these insights. But they are very dangerous, and if they can cause psychosis, and they can cause all sorts of things. So they have to be done in the correct, appropriate, thoughtful, therapeutic way. But to cut to the chase, I think they are moksha medicine, as Ram Das put it.
Thank you.
So I'll just say once more, I think there are a few more slots open for the course.
Where do we find the course?
It's on the same Adventures in Awareness website. There's a 4-week course starting not next week, but the week after. and I go into more details. It'll be a bit more, I'll actually use the screen and slides a little bit more, a little less low tech, but that's okay. Now you get the idea that we're in the deep end of practice, so we can go in the deep end of science.
Is there any books you had some publications?
Yeah, I mean, I've got sort of technical publications, which I don't necessarily, I mean, they're very interesting on the theory of consciousness and meditation and how it works. Probably if you want to kind of like really go into this, you know, I've got a number of talks on my YouTube channel, some of which are pretty long.
You were writing a book, is that?
Yeah, writing a book.
Okay. So book to come.
Yeah.
And we'll send an email out with all the resources. Chris, thank you so much for filming. He'll be editing this, and also the course will be both recorded and live streamed. So if you can't make the whole thing live, you'll always have the option of keeping up to date if you want to dive into this a bit further. Thank you again so much. We've got people helping. They've put out some tea and coffee. We can stick around for half an hour, chat. And again, thank you. These events obviously would not happen without your interest and attendance, and you all bring so much. So thanks one more time. And we'll